Okay, so now I want to talk about the Tehran conference, which was held between November 28th and December 1st, 1943, while the Italian campaign was raging. And it's a meeting between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. There's a number of iconic pictures of the meeting, and this was a meeting that Roosevelt had tried to get. He had wanted to get face to face with Stalin for years, but Stalin refused. And ultimately, though, Roosevelt convinces Stalin to meet face to face, but Stalin won't travel too far away from the Soviet Union. And so that's why they meet in Tehran, which is in Iran. Also, Stalin was deathly afraid of flying. He ended up flying to the meeting. When all three arrived, the U.S. The place where the U.S. Uh, delegation was going to stay seemed too dangerous, and so Stalin invited Roosevelt and his entourage to stay in a place chosen by the Soviet Union. Roosevelt accepted, but as we now know, Stalin completely bugged that place. It's a little bit unclear. I assume that Roosevelt would have known that he was being bugged by Stalin, and they would have played to the microphone. But it just shows kind of the tensions between the Allies, even as they're working together. So the big question at Tehran was Overlord. Well, there were two questions. One of the question was, and it doesn't really deal with this course, is whether or not the Soviets would fight against the Japanese. And actually, they end up fighting. They end up agreeing to fight against the Japanese. You might remember that the Russians actually have a neutrality pact with the Japanese until August of 1945. But at Tehran, Stalin agrees to fight the Japanese once the Germans are defeated. Now you can forget about it because that's not part of this course, but you might be interested. More importantly for this course is whether or not where would the invasion, where would the second front happen? When would it happen? As you should know by now, Churchill was very opposed to the Operation Overlord. And it's interesting, there's a couple of books that have been written. Churchill really kind of hid. He wrote his post-war memoirs. He survived the war. Roosevelt didn't survive the war. And of course, Stalin didn't write memoirs. And after the war, Churchill said, hey, look, it's an urban legend that I was opposed to Overlord. I was supportive of Overlord all along. And a lot of people, historians, bought this until the early part of this century when some new documents came out and were declassified. And it's crystal clear that Churchill opposed Overlord, that he wanted to just put it off, put it off, put it off. So by late 1943, when Tehran happens, the US military wants to invade France in May or June of 1944. And Churchill, of course, is dragging his feet. He doesn't want that to happen. So basically, what you have is you have three powers, right? The US, England, and the Soviet Union. And so the US and England were at loggerheads about when Overlord should happen. The British don't want to do it in 1944. They want to put it off for yet another year. Remember, Overlord happens, the invasion of France happens in June of 1944. The British want to put it off until 45. They still want to work on this peripheral, this soft underbelly scheme. So they're at loggerheads. So what happens is that Stalin has the tie-breaking vote at Tehran. And of course, he sides with the United States. So it's 2-1. Churchill is outvoted. And what's important about Tehran is that's when the final decision to invade France in 1944, May and June of 1944 occurs. Often in our collective memory, we think that the invasion of France, it just would have happened in June of 1944. That was the way it was always supposed to be, and this wasn't true at all. If Churchill had been in charge, there might not have been an invasion of France at all, but he was not in charge by this point. England is a declining power, was a declining power. The US is the dominant power. The Soviet Union is a strong power, and the British are really the junior partner at this time. And Churchill is caught between what did he call it? The Russian bear and the US elephant. So for a quiz or a midterm, the importance of Tehran in November of 1943 and early December is that's when the final decision to implement Operation Overlord, the invasion of France in June of 1944, is made. So that's a big deal. It's a big deal. Normally I wouldn't talk about conferences because they get kind of mind-numbing. But this is important because it's the big three. They're all meeting face to face. It's a very, very tough trip for Roosevelt. And in fact, Roosevelt really never recovers from Tehran. His health was just awful during World War II. As most of you know, he had been paralyzed by polio in the early 1920s. But what really got him, he had a heart condition, and his medical care was wretched. In fact, the Navy doctor in charge of Roosevelt, his medical care, after Roosevelt died, he burned Roosevelt's medical records. So anyway, Roosevelt, he still has his wits about him. He still is, I think, a master global strategist. But his health never really recovers. It was a very, very tough flight for him to get to Tehran, but he was determined to meet Stalin face to face, in large part because he wants to entangle Stalin into the war against the Japanese, which he does, but also to make these final decisions about the invasion of France. So, and also there were some discussions about what the post-war world was like. During this, Stalin and Roosevelt kind of ganged up on Churchill. Stalin was saying, hey, after we win, we're going to execute 50,000 German officers. And maybe one of the documentaries talked about this. And Roosevelt said, no, let's not do that. Let's only execute 49,000. And Churchill stomped out of the meeting because he didn't want to be involved in a mass execution, which of course didn't happen. But it kind of just shows the power balance and how it had slipped from Churchill. But make no mistake about it. Although he tried to cover his tracks after the war, Churchill did everything he could do to delay Overlord. But at Tehran, he was outvoted. He was outvoted. Now, the other aspect of Tehran, which I want to talk about, is something that's almost completely forgotten in the West. And that is Stalin also agreed to mount a major invasion against the German army at the same time the U.S., about the same time, the U.S. Was attacking Normandy. So that the German army faced attacks on the east and the west at about the same time. And this becomes Operation Bagration, which I'm going to talk about later in the class. But the big point the take-home point I want you to take here is that the Soviet Union launched a major attack on the German army on the Eastern Front at 2 weeks after D-Day. And this was a coordinated action on the part of the Soviet Union. So although we often forget it in the United States, in June of 1944, not only did the Germans face the Allied invasion into France, but the Germans also faced a major Russian offensive, which happened 2 weeks later in the East. And Stalin agreed to that at Tehran as well. Now, I'll talk about that Operation Bagration later on in the course. But the Germans face a two-front assault in June of 44, and Stalin agrees to that. So the Tehran conference, extremely important. And just one more time, Roosevelt's outvoted. Stalin and Roosevelt align pretty easily about the significance of invading France, which is what Roosevelt's military had always wanted to do. And the die is cast, and Roosevelt, the soft underbelly strategy, which would have been a total catastrophe, is finally defeated.